I would like to kick us off with a discussion of enforcement of our environmental laws and the dramatic regulatory rollbacks that we've already experienced in the first 2 months of the new administration. So, as people probably have read, the Department of Justice has reassigned its environmental crimes unit to focus on immigration instead. Staff has been cut at the EPA, and further cuts are on the way. So I would like to hear from the team what broadly this means for the health of the Hudson River and for our drinking water. And so I'll start with Mike as our legal director. How do you see this reduction in enforcement facing us here locally?
Yeah, and thanks, Tracy. All of those important environmental laws are still on the books, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and all of that. But those laws are only as good as the enforcement of them. And with the EPA sort of taking a step back and Department of Justice potentially taking a step back, that means that the states and private citizens and NGOs like us will have to pick up some of that slack in enforcement. And that's extremely resource intensive. It's very time consuming to monitor waters, to investigate pollution, and then to bring lawsuits to stop it. But that is something that we do all of the time. And it's something that I think we're going to have to step into that role even more over the next few years while EPA is taking a step back. One interesting sort of consequence of EPA taking a step back is that all of those deregulatory measures that have been announced, they're still going to be, those have to be backed by science and by law when the agency takes those types of actions. And it's going to be difficult for the agencies to do those without the correct staff in place to get it right. And so if they make mistakes, those are areas where Riverkeeper is going to have to really watch and try to intervene where we can.
Yeah, so you make a good point. Laws are only meaningful if they're enforced, right? So where are the opportunities for Riverkeeper or New York State or other NGOs to pick up some of the slack as we anticipate a reduction in enforcement of our Keystone laws?
Yeah, I think the state attorney general's office is already looking for areas which EPA is not enforcing in, areas that they may be leaving holes. Riverkeeper is doing the same thing. We have a watchdog program, and I hope everybody on the call will think of us if they have any pollution tips. We do take those very seriously. We investigate them. Sometimes they do lead to citizen suits and enforcement actions, sometimes jointly with the states, to stop pollution. So those are areas where we're going to step in. We're also going to be stepping in a lot on these deregulatory measures. So each regulation that is promulgated, even if it's removing a regulation, will have to go through public notice and comment. And then there will be an opportunity for judicial review of those things. So those are areas where we're going to step up, make sure that EPA, if they are taking action, that they are backed by science and backed by the law. And if they're not, those are areas where we can and have sued the agency in the past. And certainly we need, members to be supporting this work, science, vote, policy, to make sure we have the resources necessary to do all that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mike. So other areas that are very much in the news are all the cuts. So we know that the EPA budget has been cut by 65%. The EPA Office of Research and Development could see cuts of up to 75% with over 1,100 employees laid off. And NOAA has already lost 500 staff and is facing potentially deeper cuts. So what's the impact of that reduction in workforce and funding? Jeremy, can you give us a sense?
Yeah, I mean it's really tragic. It is vast, and it's going to take some time for the impacts to really percolate through. One of the things people might not think about is that the EPA and other federal agencies provide community assistance, technical assistance for upgrading wastewater infrastructure, ensuring the delivery of clean drinking water through targeted upgrades. Let's say a small municipality doesn't have planning or engineering staff. Those were roles that the EPA could step in, and they could help a small community of maybe 2,000 water users upgrade their supply if there was a problem or if it was aging out, that they're no longer going to have access to. Um, and the state does have some technical assistance programs, but there is no way the state can fill in all the gaps that the federal government is about to leave behind. Some of the other things are rapid responses to crises such as chemical spills, like we saw in East Palestine, Ohio, or fossil fuel spills, which many of you who are watching might, know about our past campaigns about the barges on the Hudson River, the oil barges. The Coast Guard handles the main stem of the Hudson, the spill response, but it's the EPA that is on point for inland spills. If a rail car tips over and there's a hazardous material spill, are there going to be the right staff in place to respond to a disaster in the middle of the night? We may, with the Office of Research and Development, which is the scientific arm of EPA, we might lose the ability to characterize toxic chemicals, ones that have already been introduced into products in the environment, and ones that industry are introducing every single year that we might not know if those are going to poison the environment or your family. In regards to NOAA, they are absolutely critical on the Hudson for navigational safety. All the large ships on the Hudson, they rely on the systems that NOAA funds and puts in place with the state of New York. And we receive, New York, the Hudson receives $800,000 in funding from NOAA that's at risk by the end of 2025. And we'll have a link that we can share where you can send a message to your member of Congress sharing how important this NOAA funding is, keeping these sensors online so the pilots on the river can be aware of conditions and dangers. It's so, so important. And Mike, what do you think? I mean, there's been a lot of fast moving action in the courts. What's been going on there?
Yeah, and in one word, and this is a term of art, chaos. A lot of the proposed job cuts at the federal level have been challenged, and courts have issued restraining orders to stop those. So there's a case, the American Federation of Government Employees, the AFL-CIO versus Office of Personnel Management, and that's a coalition of unions who sued to stop the firing of more than 10,000 federal workers. And a judge in California issued a temporary restraining order, but that case is now being appealed to the Supreme Court. So it'll be an interim ruling that we're going to hear from the Supreme Court on this case, but it should indicate where they're headed on these job cuts. So that'll tell us a lot. And similarly, the funding freezes are also caught up in temporary restraining orders. So they've been stayed, and those funds are supposed to be released. And at least 6 courts hearing this issue with different parties in different regions of the country have stayed those. So that's where we are right now, but none of these cases are final. They're all interim motions as the cases proceed to a final judgment.
All right. So, the federal cuts, we heard about how we rely on federal experts and enforcement, but also not everybody realizes that quite a bit of our state investments are actually funds that come through the federal government. So there's about 30% of the funding for our New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is actually federal funds that comes to the state and then is allocated for local priorities. So where can we anticipate to see the impacts on local state spending for the environment?
Well, as people might know, politicians in Albany right now are negotiating, up to an April 1st deadline for a state budget. And you got to feel for them because these federal budget cuts are coming on heavy right now when they're trying to plan what the next fiscal year is going to look like. But the courts are intervening, restoring funding, while new funding is being proposed to be taken away. And so it's creating a real paralysis in terms of how the state can plan for this. We have the Hudson River Estuary Program at DEC, which is our main partner in the long recovery of the Hudson, at least our state government partner. And as I said, they have the NOAA funding through the end of the year. and all these systems to keep navigation on the river safe. And obviously, the state is not going to let that be abandoned, and neither will Riverkeeper. So if they run out of that funding, the state will have to move funds around DEC, which means some other priorities might not get funded, important priorities. And so it's gonna be tough, and we have not seen a significant effort to prepare for cuts. We've seen an attitude of letting chips fall if they may, going to the courts to seek temporary restraining orders and injunctions. But our team, we're in Albany every single week, pushing for proactive policies for additional funding. We're patrolling the halls, we're getting our 10,000 steps in, we're talking with legislators, and it's really the slow work to make sure that we do have policies that can stand in the breach while all this is unfolding around us. But it's incredibly difficult to plan right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're all feeling that. That uncertainty. And I appreciate that, what I've heard in Albany too, when we were up lobbying, is that they're going to kind of go forward with business as usual and then just kind of wait and see. So whatever happens after the budget, it does generate a lot of work and uncertainty for folks who are making that happen right now. So other things that are taking place that I'm sure people want to hear about is some of these specific rollbacks. We heard from our new EPA regional administrator, Lee Zeldin, proudly announcing the largest rollback and deregulations of 31 laws that protect our health and environments. Just 2 weeks ago. So that was a pretty stunning announcement and a list of actions that were being taken. One of the things they did right out of the gate, even before that, was rolling back the PFAS discharge limits for industrial polluters. They also have now said they're moving ahead with rolling back plan protections for lead service line replacement, which was enacted and funded under the Biden administration. They also are talking about dropping mercury limits that have been in place for decades and are the reason why we've gotten on top of acid rain. Young people might not even know that term on this call. Acid rain was something we were fighting thanks to mercury pollution that really impacts our drinking water and water quality. So I'd like to turn to Shannon and hear, with your expertise in emerging contaminants, what are you looking at? And what should we be looking at, especially in terms of local impacts for our bioregion coming out of these decisions?
So with all of these decisions, we're going to see the same result, and that is just that there's going to be more pollution that enters our waterways, and that means that it is going to endanger recreational safety for folks who are wanting to swim in the water. It is going to impact drinking water safety in every watershed in the Hudson Valley for the New York City drinking water system. When we reduce, our regulations that are meant to prevent discharges of toxic contaminants, we will just see an abundance of those contaminants in our surface water, our groundwater, our drinking water. In the case of the lead service line replacement, this is a huge problem. We have 9 million lead service lines in the United States. We know that there's no safe level of lead. Both lead and mercury are very well established to be neurotoxins. And we have about 56% of the country's population right now who are drinking water that has lead above a safe level. So the fact that we enacted this wonderful program to try to get rid of the lead service lines, and that's been just completely halted, it guarantees that we're going to have health impacts, especially to children, and especially to our most vulnerable members of society, people with who are immunocompromised, pregnant women, the elderly, and children are who these rollbacks are really going to hit the hardest. And so, at a time when we have, 80,000 chemicals that are used in commerce, and we only are regulating 90 of them in drinking water, what we need are more regulations. We need to understand what the threats are that are being posed by all of these new chemicals that are created every year. And we need to make sure that they don't get into our water systems and they don't impact human health and they don't impact aquatic species. So we are going in the opposite direction where we need to be going.
Yeah, yeah. And so they say, what you don't know can't hurt you. But I think in this arena, what you don't know absolutely is what hurts you. We're already very minimally protected by our regulations in terms of emerging contaminants. We have a history of not updating our federal list. And then there's a mad scramble when we're really far down the line on harm happening from different contaminants, like PFAS, to do catch up. So one of the other things that's of great concern, I know we talk about it on our team, is the reduction in research. So can you speak to what we're seeing in terms of research and what research the Hudson River and our work kind of relies on that's under threat? And anything we could do to, what we can do to try and address and others can do to help hold on to that knowledge.
Sure. So there are a number of federal agencies that do research. So EPA, the Office of Research and Development, which is the current plan is to basically dissolve the Office of Research and Development at EPA. EPA as a public agency is designed to protect public health. So it's designed to protect people from air pollution and water pollution that can make them sick. And the way that we do that is we have to first understand, what are the contaminants that can make you sick? How much of them do you need to be exposed to until you get sick? And how do they get into the environment? How do they change in the environment? And how can we remove them from the environment? So EPA has a mandate to use the best available science whenever they're writing a regulation. So for example, when EPA decided to make drinking water regulations for PFAS last year, they made maximum contaminant levels, so the maximum amount of PFAS that can be in drinking water. And in order to determine what that concentration is, it takes a lot of science. We have to understand, what is the concentration where people will start to get sick. You need toxicologists, you need exposure assessment experts. There's even economists who do cost benefit analysis in terms of setting those, sort of like concentrations that would be reasonable for technology to actually be able to remove them. So there's all kinds of science that happens when, for example, EPA is setting a limit. And so if we remove that science from decision making, it's unclear how you would even make a regulation. And I think in effect, what will happen is that you will not, because you don't have the staff to do the science that you would need to do to set those regulations in the first place. And it's not just EPA. The NIH has a sub-organization, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Science. They also do research around environmental health, have done studies showing, for example, that hurricanes can contribute to elevated levels of pesticides in drinking water due to storm surge. And the National Science Foundation. All of these agencies are being cut right now. And so not only do we not have the science that we need to create new regulations, but we are not funding science in universities. And so universities who rely on grant money from these agencies to do this research as well, it's not only done by staff scientists at federal agencies, those programs are just going to not be able to accept students. So we are taking, right now we have a graying workforce in the water sector. A lot of people came into this work, when EPA was created in the 70s, and those people are retiring. So now is the time where we actually need a reinvigoration, and we need a lot of people to move into the sciences. And every, thing that's happening now, the cuts at the federal agencies, the reduction in grant money is going to shrink that science workforce. So these are going to be generational impacts to scientific research, to our understanding of pollution and human health, and how we can, fix those things, and really ultimately reduce death and illness in the United States. It's a huge, huge, huge problem.
Yeah. That's a lot to take in.
Sorry.
We're here to really, share what we know. And these are the things we talk about around our conference table and our desks. So we'll come back to science. I'm going to pivot now to another part of our government that has these far-reaching impacts that go on, for decades. And talk about the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has handed down some key decisions recently that undercut our federal agencies' ability to fulfill their missions, protecting the environment and public health. Mike, can you break down as simply as you can what those decisions are, what people need to know about these decisions that affect our mission area and our community?
Right. There were two major blockbuster Clean Water Act cases that came through the Supreme Court recently. One was the Sackett case, which narrowed the definition of waters of the United States, which means waters that are not directly adjacent to and continuously flowing with navigable waterways are potentially in jeopardy of losing their protections under the Clean Water Act. So if you pollute a water that's not jurisdictional or doesn't fall within that, it's not actually a violation of the Clean Water Act. So it's really important that that be a really broad definition, and the Supreme Court narrowed it. And then a lot more recently, there was a city and county of San Francisco case that folks may have heard about. And this is a little bit of a wonkier case, but this is regarding Clean Water Act permits, which are called NIPDES permits, and what types of limitations can be included in those. And typically, you would think of a permit stopping pollution or placing a limit on pollution at the end of a pipe. And we call those technological limitations. So how much pollution can come out of your pipe? There are other restrictions and permits that are based on the water quality of the receiving waters, and those are still valid, but the court found that where there's a sort of general backstop provision that says if your, discharge from your pipe causes a violation of water quality standards, which are basically the maximum limits of pollutants that can be in that waterway, then that's a violation of the permit. It's a violation of the Clean Water Act, and it is enforceable. It would be enforceable by Riverkeeper in a citizen suit or by a state or federal government. And so those general backstop provisions are no longer available to permit writers. And so they're no longer, and the ones that exist are no longer enforceable.
Yeah. Wow. So there's so many layers of how the government works. And I think a lot of people don't understand, all of these different levels, a law, an executive order, a permit, and a rulemaking. So one of the things that we're also seeing is rolling back of executive orders. So what Biden was able to get things done in a quick way with an executive order, which is kind of a quicker action with less long-term protection. And now Trump kind of rolling back executive orders and issuing his own. So one of the targets of this that's giving people whiplash is in the environmental justice space. The Biden administration really leaned into saying we need to focus on the fact that there are communities that are sacrifice zones where most of the pollution and the polluting infrastructure has been cited, and put a lot of very clear language in place for people to invest in a way to offset and right those historic harms. And now that's something that the Trump administration is very aggressively kind of pulling back on and attacking. So maybe, Jeremy, you could tell us a little bit about how that attack on focusing on environmental justice and historic harms, is it going to reach us in New York? Can New York still stay true to those principles, and how does that break down?
Oh, absolutely, it's going to reach us. I mean, we have communities that from New York City all the way to Albany and Buffalo and not to mention, and you know, that we've worked on closely in Newburgh that have suffered enormous environmental injustices. And there have been roles that the federal government, EPA, has stepped in and set up, you know, for some communities in the Bronx, have set up, you know, air monitoring programs to find out, is this community specifically getting a disproportionate amount of air pollution from facilities, vehicles, deliveries happening. And that funding and that programmatic focus is now going to be gone. And so if we don't know the answer to those questions, then we can't target policies and solutions that actually help people, which is, you know, what at the end of the day, you know, in addition to helping the environment, we're trying to help people, our fellow residents here in New York. And, you know, we don't even know what the consequences are going to be of funding cuts at the Department of Defense, which is involved in the Newburgh PFAS contamination case, and has been paying for clean water for the people of the city of Newburgh. And, you know, it's more of this uncertainty that prevents us from being able to plan for what comes next. But at least in New York State, we have laws on the books around environmental justice. The state is still, you know, they're not perfect. I'm never going to say that they're perfect. They get a lot wrong, but they're still prioritizing environmental justice. We have a new cumulative impacts rule that was a law that was passed in 2022. It's gone through a rulemaking process that will require for new projects that reach a certain threshold, you know, the permit will have to look like, is this project creating a disproportionate burden on this community that might have suffered, you know, might have other factories, other emission sources, other pollution affecting their water supply, their air. And that will be a deciding factor in whether or not DEC or another state agency or a city, whoever the lead agency is, approves or denies a permit for a disadvantaged community. We have some of our state spending, like the Environmental Bond Act, which is $4.2 billion that was approved by voters. That in the law requires that 30% of that funding goes to designated disadvantaged communities, which is actually physically on a map that New York State has put together that they have to follow and get funding to these communities. You know, some of the state agencies like DEC have dedicated environmental justice staff that think about these issues, that try and help these communities that have suffered for so long from not having government help them. But we have to do more to make sure everybody has clean air and clean water. We have to work with our partners like We Act for Environmental Justice, with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, with the Newburgh Clean Water Project. There's so many great groups that are representing communities that the government had left behind, that groups like ours help support, and people on this call should also support because they do great work.
Thank you. So it seems that, you know, basically so long as it's New York State funded, we can continue on our path of our state commitments, but anything probably that's federally funded passing through for these priorities is going to take a hit. And similar, that seems to also be the state of play with our climate change and resilience related work. So the state has made big commitments. We have our great state Climate Protection Act. We have funding for resilience projects in the Bond Act and many good efforts to try and mitigate and also adapt to climate change. But of course, that is something that the federal government, you know, it's one of these terms that's become a political football, even though it's a physical reality. So we're seeing some manifestations of that with cuts to NOAA, cuts to FEMA and HUD and some of these disaster response organizations that we're more and more reliant on. So what can we do in New York? How, you know, maybe Shannon, you can give us kind of an overview on our local impacts and what we're going to need to do to kind of fill holes and prepare for lack of commitment to respond on the federal government.
Sure. So I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call that climate change is happening. I think we can all see it around us in a multitude of ways. The Hudson is getting warmer, sea level is rising. There was a recent study that found that in New York City, a 500-year flood, which is a flood that is supposed to happen once every 500 years, in the coming decades will happen once every 5 years. So this is just like a huge increase in the amount and severity of flooding. So we're going to see property damage, damage to infrastructure like wastewater and drinking water treatment plants. All of this will impair water quality. And beyond flooding, we know that climate change is going to impact water quality in a variety of ways. Riverkeeper will be releasing a report in a few weeks that describes some of the impacts of climate change on drinking water quality. And a lot of this revolves around extreme events, extreme precipitation events, and storm events. And so if we have huge cuts to FEMA or something as drastic as FEMA being entirely eliminated, the disaster response will be left to the states. And it will be very difficult, and the funding will not be there to respond to the huge problems that we will see. We will see power grids go out. We will see immediate problems and need immediate disaster sort of action when these storms happen. But cuts to agencies like NOAA also make it harder for us to understand and forecast extreme events, to forecast sea level rise. So it's cuts at the agencies that will help us to understand and adapt to climate change, and then cuts to agencies that will help us to respond to the disasters when they occur. And so I think it'd be great if Jeremy could talk a little bit about some state legislation that we are supporting. In addition to that, we've, provided some resources for municipalities in our upcoming climate impacts to drinking water report with suggestions for how they can incorporate climate resilient planning into their long-term plans at the county level and at the city level. But Jeremy, could you tell us a little bit more about that legislation?
Yeah, so we're supporting what's called the Climate Resilient New York Act. This is S 3590, that is sponsored by Senator Harkin, who's our state environmental conservation chairman in the Senate. And this legislation will fill a critical gap that we've seen over a number of years in doing this type of storm resilience planning, climate resilience planning, drinking water resilience planning, that there's a lack of coordination amongst the state agencies, whether you're talking about the State Department of Environmental Conservation or the State Department of Health's Bureau of Water Supply Protection. You even have agencies you wouldn't even think of, like the Department of Transportation or the New York State Thruway Authority, that has a role to play in protecting drinking water, for example, because they apply road salt. And so this bill puts a cabinet level officer in the governor's cabinet and coordinators in each of the state agency that report to that officer. So there's a direct line to the governor. And then it also requires the creation of a state plan with benchmarks, metrics, reporting requirements. So the state can actually set those targets. The public can track the way the state is reaching those goals and hold the state accountable along the way. So we think it's a really strong bill, and a number of other states like Maryland, some Louisiana, even Florida have legislation and positions like this. And we think it will be really important for New York to put this in place.
Okay, that is a little bit of hopefulness there. I think maybe at this point, let's take some questions from the audience, and then we can come back and do a little more on actions, some specific actions that Riverkeeper can take and that folks here can do with us and take on their own. So I'm going to open it up to some questions that came in. I want to remind people, if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we also now, while we answer questions, we can bring up a slide that includes some QR codes where you could actually scan those with your phone and take some actions right now. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question from Rebecca Martin, our colleague and collaborator. Thank you, Rebecca. So she wants to know if we can explain the difference between executive orders and legislation. She says, we know that the administration can make changes within the administration, and that's dangerous. But what teeth do executive orders have when actual laws require the checks and balances of government? And what executive orders that we know of may be impacting our drinking water here in New York State? So why don't we start with Mike on what is an executive order, and then Shannon or Jeremy, if you have any specific to our drinking water you want to highlight.
Okay, well, executive orders are directives by the president to agencies to basically how those agencies can and should carry out their duties. Those are supposed to comport with law. Laws are different. Laws are enacted by Congress. They are passed by the president. And so executive orders, I would say, are a rung lower than legislation. Where they don't comport, I think you are seeing this happen a lot right now, that executive orders are being deemed invalid, or that they're, at least judges have been very skeptical of them in these early stages of litigation during this new administration. But it's yet to be seen exactly how they're going to apply and what executive orders are going to carry what weight. And I think we're going to actually have to hear from the Supreme Court on that. I know that some of the executive orders that have been issued, they affect a lot of things, but where there's funding that has been directed to municipalities, some of that funding is going to water infrastructure and water supply protection. Some of that is up in the air. I know there are directives to expand energy capacity, think like natural gas pipelines and oil pipelines and other infrastructure to be developed quickly. And there have been executive orders about regulatory review to sort of lessen that review or lessen the opportunities for the public to engage in that kind of review. And all of those, they affect everything really, but they also affect drinking water and other waters.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, some of the things that are concerning about a few of the executive orders is there was one that came out that basically tells polluting industries that if you don't want to follow any of the regulations that have been put into place by laws of Congress, required by laws of Congress, or authorized by laws of Congress, the Department of Justice, EPA, they're just not going to enforce it. And they're telling these agencies, they're telling these industries like coal industry, manufacturers of chemicals, that they can write the administration an email and get a free out of jail card for discharging pollutants into the environment. And that's really concerning because we have to have a rules-based system about our environmental regulations, because it can't be a free-for-all, because that's when we all get toxins in our environment and in our bodies.
Yeah. All right. Well, staying on that question, that point around toxins and contaminating our water. So we have a question from Melina Hamer, who asks, what kind of testing of groundwater can we as citizens do? And is there a community-wide network to see updates from other people in the region, specifically online place where groundwater data could be shared?
That's a good question. So, Riverkeeper has a very robust monitoring program. We monitor at over 200 locations in the estuary and the tributaries once a month, May through October. And, some of the tributaries we monitor are under the influence of groundwater, but monitoring groundwater itself is a little bit tricky because you need access to a well. So you've got to, you're really kind of like relying on whoever owns the well. So that could be a town, it could be a private citizen. And if a private citizen wanted to test their well, that would be, they could collect a sample. If they were interested, they could work with us. We could help them to analyze the sample or point them in the direction of a laboratory. In terms of sharing that data, we work with a number of community partners who monitor tributaries and monitor other parts of the estuary. All of that goes into our data portal, which is actually being rebuilt right now. It will be, we'll have all kinds of community data from DEC. DEC does have some groundwater data that's available on the DEC info locator. I'm not sure if we'll have that data from DEC, but we'll have other data from DEC, from NOAA, information on drinking water, climate change, and recreation. So yeah, I know that's a little bit of I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but I guess I could say if you were really interested in doing some groundwater monitoring and you had access to a well, certainly reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you kind of get that going.
I will say there is legislation in the state budget that we're hoping makes it over the finish line that will provide some resources for private well owners. So if you're a homeowner and have a private well, to have some state funding available where you can get your well water tested. And the state having some of that information about what's in the groundwater from points all across the state from private wells will give us more data points to draw conclusions about how different contaminants are affecting groundwater.
Yeah, so I think this discussion has been a great example of that classic circle that you see at EPA, where it's measure, right, to identify the problems, plan and action to address them, and then measure the impact of that plan that it's having an effect and repeat. So the breakdown that we're seeing with science, with monitoring, with law enforcement really breaks that feedback loop that is what we all have used since the Clean Water Act was passed in 1973, and leaves us, somewhat on our own to continue to do that work and fill those gaps and keep that going. So with that, why don't we kind of bring it back to the panel to share things that you think people can do. I will just say before I pass it over to you to kind of share any hopeful or tactical, or it could be something not to do, kind of final thoughts you want to share with our participants. And while we're doing that, just mentioning again on the screen here, we do have 3 actions people can take if you haven't taken them yet. The first one is to sign our letter supporting NOAA, the National Office of Atmospheric Administration. I'm getting that right. And then become a member of Riverkeeper, support us. Obviously, I think you're hearing a lot of ways in which we are engaging in that circle of protecting our environment, and our workload is going to increase in these coming years with this administration. And then finally, signing up for an advocacy day we have coming up. If you'd like to join us, Jeremy and his team, in particular up in Albany, we would love to have you. So with that, who wants to go first in kind of closing thoughts for this evening?
Well, I'll talk about 2 things that I think people should be looking to do in the coming months. And the first is coming back to that watchdog program. Riverkeeper staff, we can't be everywhere looking for everything. So we do take watchdog notices very seriously, and we investigate those. So if you do see pollution or know about it or hear about it, we want to know. So send us some information, and you can find our hotline on our website. And then we are going to be responding to a lot of deregulatory measures, and we're going to be submitting a lot of comments, and we're going to want the public to weigh in. So we will be sending out notices for the public. We call them action alerts for the public to quickly sign a letter, a petition, or even write your own letter to help shape what those actions, those regulations look like. And right now, I mean, today we filed one because the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, regulations are being gutted. And we have an action alert up on our website about the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which will become a lot more important for actions that happen in New Jersey, because those two things will dovetail together. So you can go online and you can go on our website and find that action alert for seeker right now. And just watch in the coming weeks and months for a lot more of those types of actions.
So I would just add to that, Riverkeeper, we're trying to address this by doing more monitoring, doing more research, encouraging strong state standards. And I think, what you can do, the best thing for you to do is, find out what's happening in your local community. Go to your city council meeting, go to your town board meeting, take a walk through your neighborhood, go out on a kayak, check, assess the local conditions, and see, are there problems? And, if there are problems, those are things you can report to us through the Watchdog program. Things you can talk with your local leaders about in your municipality. Local counties and municipalities have, the ability to set local laws and do planning exercises that you can take part in. And, Riverkeeper has a variety of sort of programs and materials that and information on our website that could help you with that. So I would really say, keep up with our action alerts, but my biggest piece of advice is just to keep fighting and just keep at it.
Jeremy.
Yes, and I'll certainly, echo what Mike said. Send a message through our action alert supporting the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Sign up for our alerts so you can receive new actions, ways to engage. And then something we haven't mentioned yet that I really want to stress, that might feel hard right now, but it's so important, is you need to call your members of Congress. Even if your members of Congress are people who you might think are on the right side, doing the right thing, there are a lot of competing priorities right now. And when there are a lot of competing priorities, the environment, clean water might fall by the wayside. And so it is so important that that if you are so concerned that you are joining this webinar tonight, that you want to know about what's happening to clean water, your member of Congress needs to know that that's something you are concerned about. So look them up, call their district office, call their DC office, and even better, write a handwritten note. I know it's old-fashioned, but send a handwritten note, because I hear this from politicians all the time that it makes such a difference. And a lot of times you get written letters back. And unlike a phone call, you won't always get a written response. But if you write a letter, there's a record and you can follow up on your letter. It's so important. Show up at a town hall. If your Congress member is having a town hall, ask them about threats to the climate, ask them about these threats to clean water and what they are doing about it. And then finally, join us in Albany if you can on April 29th for Earth Day Advocacy Day. We have a lot of important environmental bills that are waiting to get pushed over the finish line. We are working closely with dozens of other environmental and climate and environmental justice groups, partnering, collaborating for collective action on this day, because really at the end of it, the only way we are going to push back against this is not just Riverkeeper alone, but Riverkeeper with all of you, with all of our other partners standing strong in the breach.
Well said. Well said. Thank you to the whole team. Thank you everyone for spending time with us. Clean water is the most bipartisan human issue. It's not a political football. It is something that, the majority of Americans agree is something they expect the federal government to provide. So it's a great place for us to find common cause and build coalitions. And we really hope you will join our mailing list, not because you need more email, but because it'll give you opportunities to take action and also come out and do some in-person work with us. And we do need to kind of know our neighbors and build these networks so we can be stronger, have stronger voices, and also when our disasters come, that we are able to know who's where and how we can support each other and be showing up as proud members of the Hudson Valley in New York City. So thank you again for your time tonight. We hope to hear from you and be working together to protect our clean water for now and for the next 11 administrations. So with that, have a good night. Thanks, everybody.